A 72-year-old disabled veteran wheeled himself into my courtroom facing a $25,000 lawsuit for malicious property destruction. He was missing his left leg from the knee down, completely reliant on a manual wheelchair. And according to the slick property manager standing opposite him, this elderly man had single-handedly trashed a luxury apartment. The moment I looked at the plaintiff's smug face and then down at the case file, I knew something was profoundly wrong. My name is Judge Judith Sheindlin, and I've been on the bench long enough to recognize when the legal system is being manipulated to crush someone who can't fight back. This was one of those cases that immediately makes your blood boil. Arthur Pendleton sat before me that Thursday morning, his weathered hands gripping the rims of his wheelchair. He wore a faded army jacket, his posture impeccably straight, radiating a quiet, stoic dignity. On the other side of the aisle stood Richard Vance, a 30-something real estate developer in a custom-tailored suit who looked like he'd never done a hard day's physical labor in his entire life. He confidently walked into the courtroom, fully believing his money, his status, and his corporate title would guarantee him a swift victory. Vance started laying out the charges like he was performing a rehearsed theatrical monologue. Your Honor, the defendant caused catastrophic damage to the imported hardwood floors, destroyed the custom cabinetry in the kitchen, and left the master bathroom plumbing in absolute ruins, he declared, his chin raised, not even bothering to look at Mr. Pendleton. We are seeking the maximum allowable limit of $25,000 for malicious destruction of property, blatant breach of contract, and extensive legal fees. I held up my pen. He stopped talking immediately. Mr. Vance, I said, looking directly into his eyes, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. Before we proceed with this grocery list of imaginary disasters, I need you to tell me something. Did you actually visit this property and review this lease before you filed this lawsuit? He blinked, his manufactured confidence faltering for just a fraction of a second. Yes, Your Honor. My team documented the catastrophic damage extensively. The defendant completely ignored the terms of his lease and treated our luxury property with blatant disrespect. I let his arrogant words hang in the air, echoing in the quiet courtroom. I turned to the defense table. Mr. Pendleton, how old are you? I asked, softening my voice just a fraction. 72, Your Honor, he replied, his voice raspy but firm. And how long have you been confined to that wheelchair? 6 years, Your Honor. Complications from an old service injury. I turned my attention back to the developer. My patience entirely evaporated. He's 72 years old, Mr. Vance. He is missing a leg. The apartment you rented him was on the 3rd floor of a heritage building with no working elevator. Does that physical reality interest you at all, sir? Vance's face went slightly pale. The gears were turning, but they were stuck. This is exactly what happens when unchecked privilege collides with objective reality. We have landlords and corporations who churn out automated lawsuits, hoping the defendant will just default or settle out of sheer terror. A disabled veteran in a wheelchair, supposedly taking a sledgehammer to 3rd-floor luxury cabinets. Not one person in Vance's entire corporate office thought to apply an ounce of common sense before filing this $25,000 extortion attempt. But he was about to learn that power was never meant to be a shield in my courtroom. Vance stood there at the plaintiff's table, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Your Honor, our documentation clearly states. I have the original lease right here, Mr. Vance, I interrupted, pulling a stapled document from the thick manila folder. Let's read it together, shall we? You claim Mr. Pendleton maliciously destroyed Unit 3C, a 3rd-floor apartment, but this lease, signed 4 years ago with the previous building owner, clearly places Mr. Pendleton in Unit 1A, a ground-floor, ADA-accessible unit. The courtroom was dead silent. I could see the exact moment the corporate bravado completely drained from the developer's face. He frantically flipped through his own disorganized stack of papers, his hands suddenly trembling. He thought his corporate title would protect him, but privilege collapses instantly when confronted with undeniable facts. Mr. Pendleton, I asked, turning my attention back to the veteran, did you ever set foot in Unit 3C? No, Your Honor, the veteran replied, shaking his head slowly. I haven't walked up a flight of stairs since 2018. When this new management company bought the building last year, they doubled the rent. I couldn't afford it on my military pension, so I gave my proper 30 days notice and moved into an assisted living facility. I left that ground floor apartment spotless. My daughter even helped me steam clean the carpets. I looked back at Vance, who was now visibly sweating through his expensive silk collar. This wasn't just a simple clerical error, it was a devastating display of systemic corporate negligence. His company had purchased the building and completely gutted the upper floors for luxury renovations. When their own reckless demolition crews destroyed the plumbing and flooring, their automated accounting software simply billed the massive damages to a random tenant who had recently vacated. They didn't care who they financially ruined, as long as a computer generated a payable invoice. "Your Honor, my accounting department handles the automated collections," Vance stammered, desperately attempting to shift the blame to a faceless machine. "If there was a mix-up with the unit numbers—" "A mix-up?" I fired back, my voice carrying absolute authority and echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "You didn't mix up a coffee order, sir. You filed a $25,000 lawsuit against an elderly disabled veteran for damages caused by your own construction crew. You didn't bother to check the lease. You didn't bother to look at the man's physical reality, and you certainly didn't bother to apply a single ounce of human decency." Vance was scrambling now. The confident smirk that he wore when he strutted through those double doors was completely gone. "Your Honor, clearly there has been a regrettable administrative error. If the defendant was not residing in Unit 3C, then my company will happily withdraw the lawsuit today. We consider the matter closed." "You will happily withdraw it?" I stared at him, letting my voice drop to a dangerous, steady whisper. "You drag a 72-year-old amputee into court, threaten him with a $25,000 judgment that would undoubtedly bankrupt him, and you think you can just say oops and walk away?" Arthur shifted slightly in his wheelchair, raising his hand. "Your Honor, if I may, this isn't just about the fake lawsuit. When his company bought the building, they started shutting off the water to my ground floor unit during the day to encourage me to leave faster. That's why I had to move to an assisted living facility. And when I finally left, they kept my entire $2,000 security deposit, claiming I left the place a wreck." I turned my gaze back to the defense table, feeling that familiar spark of righteous indignation. "Did you take pictures when you moved out of Unit 1A, Mr. Pendleton?" A younger woman sitting in the first row of the gallery stood up and approached the wooden gate. "I did, Your Honor. I'm his daughter, Sarah. I have the time-stamped photos right here on my phone." I gestured for my bailiff to retrieve the device. As I swiped through the images, the truth was absolutely undeniable. Unit 1A wasn't just clean, it was immaculate. The carpets were freshly steam-cleaned, the older appliances sparkled, and there wasn't a single scratch on the baseboards. This family had treated that apartment with the utmost respect, likely because they knew exactly how ruthless corporate landlords could be to vulnerable tenants. "Mr. Vance," I said, holding up the phone so he could see the glowing screen, "I am looking at a pristine, perfectly maintained apartment. Yet your automated accounting system somehow decided to confiscate this man's $2,000 security deposit. Explain that." He swallowed hard, suddenly tugging at his expensive silk tie. "Your Honor, the deposit forfeiture is standard company protocol when a tenant vacates during a major building renovation. It covers incidental deep cleaning and transition fees. Standard protocol to steal from a disabled veteran?" The courtroom gallery let out a collective, audible gasp. This wasn't a clerical accident anymore. This was a calculated, predatory business model. They specifically preyed on the elderly, assuming they wouldn't have the stamina, the financial resources, or the physical ability to fight back in a court of law. They processed vulnerable human beings like numbers on a spreadsheet, extracting every last dime without a shred of compassion. I leaned so far over the bench I could literally see the beads of sweat forming on Vance's forehead. "Standard protocol? Let me translate that corporate jargon for the court. Your protocol is to systematically steal security deposits from elderly and disabled tenants who move out, knowing full well they don't have the stamina or the financial resources to fight back in a drawn-out legal battle." Sarah, Arthur's daughter, spoke up again, her voice shaking with restrained anger. "Your Honor, I called their corporate office every single day for 3 weeks trying to get my father's money back. They just kept transferring me to automated voicemails. We desperately needed that $2,000 to help cover the down payment for his assisted living facility. They knew he was on a fixed military pension, and they just didn't care." Vance desperately tried to interrupt, grasping at straws. "Your Honor, if you read Section 4 of the lease, it clearly states that incidental cleaning fees can be deducted at management's discretion. Discretion requires a working brain and a functional conscience, Mr. Vance, and currently, I am seeing absolutely neither from your side of the room," I snapped, my gavel hitting the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack. I looked down at the pristine photos of Unit 1A again. There was no deep cleaning required here. You didn't clean this ground floor unit. You gutted it. You kept a disabled veteran's money to subsidize your luxury renovations. I wasn't going to let this go with a simple case dismissal. I've been doing this job long enough to recognize the exact playbook. A predatory management company buys an older building filled with rent-controlled, elderly, or vulnerable tenants. They make the living conditions completely unbearable, like shutting off the water in the middle of the day to force them to self-evict. Then, they steal the deposits to fund their modern upgrades and flip the units for triple the price. "Mr. Vance," I said, my voice dangerously calm, the kind of calm that terrifies an arrogant plaintiff. "How many units are in this particular building?" He hesitated, his eyes darting toward the courtroom exit. 42, Your Honor. "And how many of the original legacy tenants have vacated the premises since your company took over ownership last year?" He looked down at his expensive Italian leather shoes, I believe. 38. 38, I repeated, letting the sheer scale of the displacement sink into the silent room. "And let me ask you the million-dollar question, counselor. How many of those 38 elderly tenants received their full security deposits back?" The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The corporate smirk was completely gone. He was no longer a slick, untouchable real estate developer. He was a deer caught in the headlights of absolute justice, realizing his privilege had completely collapsed. Vance looked like he wanted the polished hardwood floor to open up and swallow him whole. "Your Honor, I don't have the exact accounting figures for every single former tenant in front of me today," he deflected, his voice dropping an octave as he desperately tried to regain some semblance of professional control. "Oh, I think you do," I shot back, leaning forward and fixing him with a stare that has broken men twice his size. "Because when you decided to file a frivolous $25,000 lawsuit in my courtroom, you submitted your company's ledger as Exhibit B to prove Mr. Sounds, Pendleton's supposed outstanding balance. But you forgot one crucial detail about submitting financial records to a judge, Mr. Vance. We actually read them." I picked up the thick stack of financial printouts his overpriced legal team had so arrogantly submitted. "I spent my morning reviewing this ledger. 38 legacy tenants moved out of your building between January and August. According to your own documentation, exactly 0 of them received their security deposits back. 0. You deducted $2,000 from 38 fixed-income seniors, citing incidental transition cleaning for units your company immediately gutted with sledgehammers. The gallery was completely silent, save for the quiet, steady hum of the air conditioning. Arthur Pendleton sat tall in his wheelchair, his jaw set, watching the man who had tormented him finally squirm under the weight of his own hubris. "That is $76,000, counselor," I continued, doing the math out loud so every single person in the room could hear the exact price of his greed. $76,000 stolen from veterans, retired teachers, and grandparents to subsidize your luxury penthouse renovations. You didn't just bend the rules. You built a predatory business model relying on the assumption that 70-year-olds wouldn't have the energy, the vision, or the legal representation to fight you in court. Vance's hands were shaking violently now. The custom-tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. "Your Honor, these matters are handled by a third-party automated processing firm. I am merely the regional director. I don't personally authorize. Do not insult my intelligence by blaming a computer for your lack of a moral compass," I thundered, cutting off his pathetic attempt to pass the buck. "You signed this lawsuit. You walked into this courtroom today fully prepared to bankrupt a disabled veteran because your automated system told you he was an easy target. But you picked the wrong target, and you certainly walked into the wrong courtroom." Vance was entirely out of ammunition. He looked frantically toward the gallery, as if hoping his high-priced corporate lawyers would suddenly burst through the doors to rescue him from the mess he had created. "Your Honor," he pleaded, his voice cracking, completely devoid of the sneering arrogance he had walked in with. "If the court pleases, my company is willing to immediately cut a check for Miss Pendleton's $2,000 deposit today. We will waive all alleged damages. I formally request to dismiss this case without prejudice." "Request denied." I fired back instantly, the sharp sound of my voice making him flinch. "You do not get to use the American legal system as a weapon of mass intimidation and then simply hit the undo button the moment a judge catches you red-handed. That is not how justice works, Mr. Vance. You do not get to walk away clean just because your bullying tactics failed." I turned my attention to the case file in front of me, adjusting my glasses. "You see, while you were busy generating automated lawsuits, You failed to read the defendant's response. Mr. Pendleton didn't just show up today to defend himself against your fabricated $25,000 property damage claim. He filed a countersuit. Vance's eyes widened in genuine panic. A countersuit? Your Honor, we were never served. You were served by registered mail 3 weeks ago to the exact corporate address listed on your own letterhead, I interjected, holding up the signed delivery receipt. Your automated mailroom probably tossed it into the same shredder you use for tenant complaints. Mr. Pendleton is countersuing for the immediate return of his security deposit, plus statutory bad faith damages, moving expenses, and emotional distress caused by your company's targeted harassment. Arthur's daughter, Sarah, placed a comforting hand on her father's shoulder. Arthur looked at me, his military bearing returning. Your Honor, when they shut off my water during the day, I couldn't bathe. I couldn't wash my wheelchair. They treated me like an insect they wanted to fumigate. I didn't want to sue anybody. I served my country for 20 years, and I just wanted to live out my days in peace. But they wouldn't let me. Hearing a disabled veteran describe being treated like an insect in his own home by a greedy real estate conglomerate is the kind of thing that makes a judge want to throw the book at someone, and I fully intended to throw the entire library. In this state, withholding a security deposit in bad faith means you are liable for punitive damages up to twice the amount of the deposit, I explained, my tone glacial, ensuring he understood the trap he had walked into. That is $6,000 right there. Add in the expenses of an emergency relocation because you illegally shut off his utilities, which constitutes an illegal constructive eviction. Vance was practically hyperventilating. Your Honor, shutting off the water was just for routine maintenance on the upper floors, routine maintenance that mysteriously only happened between 8 in the morning and 5 in the evening, exclusively affecting the ground floor units occupied by legacy tenants, and conveniently lacking any of the legally required 24-hour advance warning notices? I read from the massive stack of tenant complaints Sarah had submitted as evidence. You didn't do maintenance, sir. You executed a siege. Vance was visibly shaking now, his expensive suit offering absolutely no protection against the reality of what he had done. Your Honor, please, he stammered, frantically wiping his brow with the back of his hand. The water shutoffs were a contractor error. I will personally ensure Mr. Pendleton is compensated for the inconvenience. It is far too late for manufactured corporate apologies, Mr. Vance, I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. You walked into my courtroom trying to use the law as a weapon to crush a disabled veteran. But the law is a shield for the vulnerable, not a sword for the privileged. I picked up my pen and began writing my judgment on the official ledger. Here is what is going to happen today. Your frivolous, extortionate lawsuit for $25,000 is dismissed with prejudice. You will never bring this garbage into a courtroom again. On Mr. Pendleton's countersuit, I am ordering the immediate return of his $2,000 security deposit. Furthermore, because I find your company's actions to be a textbook definition of bad faith, harassment, and constructive eviction, I am awarding the maximum statutory punitive damages of $4,000 plus $5,000 for emergency moving expenses and the severe emotional distress you intentionally inflicted upon this man. Vance looked like he was going to be physically sick right there at the plaintiff's table. $11,000? He whispered. The sheer shock of the tables turning completely, destroying his arrogant facade. I am not finished, I warned, locking eyes with him, so he understood the full gravity of his situation. I am also forwarding this entire case file, along with your company's financial ledger showing the 38 unreturned security deposits, directly to the State Attorney General's office for a formal investigation into predatory real estate practices. You thought you could target the elderly because you assumed they were weak, voiceless, and easily intimidated. You made a catastrophic miscalculation. Arthur Pendleton sat quietly, his calloused hands resting gently on the rims of his wheelchair, tears finally pooling in the corners of his eyes. His daughter Sarah gripped his shoulder, crying openly with relief. They hadn't just won their money back. They had stood up to a corporate giant, refused to be victims, and watched that giant fall. Vance mechanically packed his expensive leather briefcase, his hands fumbling with the brass clasps. The smug developer, who had swaggered into my courtroom, acting like he owned the world, was now stumbling out, facing a massive state fraud investigation and the likely collapse of his entire career. I watched him leave, offering him absolutely no sympathy. He had built his corporate wealth on the backs of the vulnerable, and today, that bill had finally come due in full. I called a brief recess to let the gallery clear. Before Arthur Pendleton wheeled himself through the heavy wooden doors, guided by his daughter, he stopped and turned his wheelchair around. He looked up at the bench, raised his hand, and offered a crisp, perfectly executed military salute. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the empty room. "Not just for getting my money back, but for making them finally see me." I nodded back, humbled by the immense grace of a man who had survived far worse battles than this one. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Pendleton. Enjoy your new home." True to my word, I forwarded the complete case file and the company's own damning financial ledger directly to the state attorney general. A local investigative news station got wind of the story within a week, and the ensuing public outrage was absolutely magnificent to witness. The state investigation uncovered systematic fraud spanning 5 different heritage buildings owned by Vance's parent conglomerate. Within 6 months, the corporation was forced to pay out over $500,000 in restitution and penalties to dozens of elderly tenants they had illegally displaced, harassed, and defrauded. Richard Vance was quietly terminated by his board of directors, his name forever radioactive in the Los Angeles real estate market. The system that was built to process and ignore people was forced to correct itself because one man refused to be bullied. 2 months after the trial, I received a photograph in my courthouse mail. It was Arthur, smiling broadly, sitting in the sunlit garden of his new assisted living facility with his daughter by his side. He had used the settlement money to upgrade to a room with a beautiful patio. I keep that photo pinned to the corkboard in my chambers. It serves as a daily, powerful reminder of exactly what this job is supposed to be about. The legal system isn't just a machine designed to process paperwork and rubber-stamp corporate demands. It is the ultimate equalizer. When unchecked power and manufactured privilege try to crush human dignity, the courtroom is where that privilege must permanently collapse. Character is what remains when power fails, and as long as I hold this gavel, common sense and justice will always have the final word.